was offered the chance to crew on this yacht. Motor ship Lady Margaret had been offered to go on it the year before when I graduated from high school, and I didn't take the opportunity. I wanted to start working and try to figure out if I was going to go to school, where I was going to go to school. And the second time I was offered, I thought, why not? It seemed like a good opportunity. I didn't have any ties. I didn't have any obligations or any payments really to speak of. So after a little while, I was only on there a short time, and some of the other crew members left the employment of the boat pretty unexpectedly. And I was asked if I knew anybody who would want to also work on the boat. So I called a few of my buddies, Dan, Todd, and Gary.
I was good friends with Gary, your dad, and he was offered the job, and then they offered me the job to be a crew member on it. Really, just all it was to take a month off of work to take the boat to Florida, and it seemed like a dream,
As best as I can remember, your dad gave me an invitation that the captain was looking for some guys to crew the boat for the remainder of the summer, and then in the fall to take the boat down to Florida to the owner's residence in Miami for the winter.
When they came up and asked me about, wanting to crew the boat down to Florida with them, and needed an extra crew hand, I agreed. I left my job and said, what the heck, let's give it a shot. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do something like that.
Then as fall approached, the plan was to take the boat down through Lake St. Clair, down the Detroit River, through Lake Erie, beginning of Lake Ontario, take it down the barge canal, eventually ending up on the Hudson River and coming into New York Harbor.
It was just really, really interesting for me if I can backtrack, going through New York State, through the Intercoastal Waterway, going through locks. I mean, not very many people get the experience of taking a big yacht through these locks.
They did not skimp on throwing parties and spending money.
They had parties in New York City, and then we were able to sightsee a little bit in New York City, so that was fun for me, never being in these big cities before. And then we went down to Washington, D.C. and did the same thing. There we had some parties on board.
And they'd have dinner cruises. I remember going up and down the Potomac, and they'd have like the Secretary of the Navy and different congressmen were on board, and Secret Service agents and stuff like that.
And there were so many people on board, and we had filled up the ship with fuel and water. I was riding with all the people. It was riding lower in the water.
The tides went out, all the channel markers moved.
And we actually grounded on a sandbar, and we could not get off.
I had to go down and try to get the ballast tanks open. All the valves were froze solid.
It was kind of embarrassing during a party, though. You got 100 people we were stuck for 2-3 hours.
Kind of hacksawed them open to get the boat to float up a little bit so we could get off. Yeah, finally got off.
As a crew, we all worked good together. We all gelled really well together, did whatever the captain said, and enjoyed ourselves at the same time.
You would take turns at the wheel, like you had a watch that you would serve, just like in the military. And you felt pretty proud. You'd be up in the wheelhouse. Had big old-fashioned ship's wheel, and you'd be up there steering it and talking to the Coast Guard on the radio.
Sometime after Washington, D.C., they came aboard to ride with us down to Miami, kind of like a vacation for them.
Tom Ogletree,
Jean, and her son Tommy.
And her son had MS, I think.
We took them on. We had left, decided to run the ocean for a while because it was as flat as the floor in here.
Perfect weather. We should be able to make it to Miami in I forget what 20 hours or something is what we figured.
And the captain's like, Gary, watch this. So he started pulling on the horns, and you could, the huge boat horn, like freighter kind of horn, the dolphins could hear it, and they literally, he told us this would happen. We were like, yeah, right. But these dolphins came, and they were they'd swim in front of the boat, and we'd be going, maybe, I think the boat could go about, maybe 10 knots, the fastest,
Yeah, we're out there and had dolphins playing in front of the boat, taking pictures of them crisscrossing and jumping alongside, everything like that.
The weather was supposed to be great. I mean, it was beautiful, warm, sunny day. I remember very, very well. In the weather all the way down to Miami was supposed to be the same.
Yeah, come nighttime, just got to some very bad weather.
The seas started picking up, though. You could really see it, but it was, well, stays like this, it's not bad. We still checked it. We checked again with the National Weather Service, and mild seas, and they were calling for it.
I remember waking up and getting kind of tossed out of my bunk. It was probably later in the day, probably 5, 6 o'clock.
It was to the point where I was starting to get nauseous, and I would go down below and start to throw up my breakfast and lunch or whatever.
Going up the stairs to the forward hatch where the crew members would come out. I remember it was almost like an elevator. Like, you'd be going up and you'd feel like, the weight of gravity, and then the boat would drop, and it just started getting rougher and rougher and rougher. And
I went back up and I think I stayed in the wheelhouse most of the rest of the night.
The way the ship was designed, it's a pretty narrow, long ship, and kind of top heavy.
The captain decided the only thing he could do was to stay into the waves. If we'd have turned broadside into the waves, he was afraid that it would cause the ship maybe to capsize.
By the time it got down to it, we were running in almost 40-foot waves.
After a point, we just thought, well, we can't really head in now, because if we take one of those waves, we'll roll.
So every time we'd go over a wave, go down it, the next one would come over.
When the bow would go down and water would come over the bow, when I was at the wheel, I could see the tack jump up that the props were coming out of the water.
Dick, the captain, had me call the Coast Guard station off of North Carolina. It was a fry pan light. It was a light station, not a lighthouse like we think of here in the Great Lakes, but it's actually like a rescue Coast Guard station. They built them on platforms.
Radio to the Coast Guard. They were trying to drive pumps to us from airplanes.
So they sent a big transport plane. I think it's a C-130, one of those huge transport planes with the tail section that drops down.
They never got close to the boat. You'd see the strobe lights, but it was really high seas, and trying to stand on the deck and fish a 100-pound pump out of the water, even if we gotten to it, I don't think we would have gotten them on the board.
One of the 20-foot runabouts, we had lost one earlier in the night, and the other one was hanging by a metal cable.
It was up there with 2 cables, and one of the cables snapped.
So the boat was just swinging back and forth on one cable.
Swinging against the side of the Lady Margaret.
I wanted to assume that it sprung a plank.
We had to go up there with bolt cutters and cut the cable. And there was like no handrail or anything up there, and I remember that was pretty scary.
The forward hatch was just a wood cover, a sliding, rolling cover. You could lift it on and off too. A wave caught it and just shattered it. So now you have basically a 3-foot by 5-foot hole in the deck.
Dick, the captain, had asked Dan and I to go out, and he said, down in my stateroom there's like a gun, like, I don't know, a couple $1,000 cash.
He told us where it was, in a flower pot, I think. We went down, grabbed it, and in the time that we were down there, maybe a minute, the water went from maybe our knees deep to our waist deep.
We started crawling back and motioned them to pull the line in, and they got us back in. And it only seemed like seconds after that, or maybe at the end of the sentence, it seemed like almost instantaneously when we were telling the captain. We were in the wheelhouse and still trying to wrestle the wheel, and a wave.
It caught the wheelhouse, and it just, the whole front of maybe the first 25 feet of the wheelhouse just vaporized. It was like exploded. The power of the wave just ripped it right off the ship.
Given the Mayday call, Mayday, Mayday, this is the motor ship Lady Margaret. We're abandoning, the wheelhouse has been, rendered inoperable. It's been pretty much crushed, and we're abandoning ship. And I remember the guy being so reasonable and calm, which is probably his training. Like, Roger that, motor ship Lady Margaret. Like, just very, you're like, you wanted to scream at him,
We all had life jackets on for a couple hours beforehand when we knew we were in distress.
For a moment, it was just chaos. Everybody went into the water.
I think it was your dad and Dan threw the life raft over the side. I brought Tommy, my friend, out next to me.
He didn't drown. He was hit in the head, probably by something, debris off of that wheelhouse.
Because that's where the steel poles from the front of the boat for the overhead canopy kind of blew away, and one of them came across, clipped me across the eye and the nose, wound up in his temple.
They said he died instantly.
And actually he did, if I'm not mistaken, he died in my arms.
Somehow everybody, except for the young man, the woman's son, found the life raft.
And before I got him in the water, a wave took him out of my arms.
The life raft had landed upside down, so the cone-shaped tent, portion was underwater, and really it was just the bottom of the raft sticking up.
So we all eventually got off the raft. The gentleman, Tom Ogletree, had a heart attack, I'm pretty sure. I don't think it was a stroke, a heart attack. And so he was having a really hard time, and probably our first reaction was to get him onto the raft.
And actually, as we got to the raft and people started getting in it, the center part sunk down enough that it really didn't matter that it was upside down.
There was several of us hanging on to the sides.
Just about everybody got on, except for Linda Stevens, the captain's wife, and we just stayed in the water and hauled onto the side. There wasn't enough room for everybody with the raft upside down.
I remember seeing fins swimming around us in the water, and at the time I was just hoping they were dolphins and not sharks, but
now all of a sudden they aren't dolphins, they're sharks, you think.
At that point there was nothing you could do because you're freezing cold, you're numb in the water, and you're in 20-foot waves going up and down like a roller coaster.
The raft had provisions on it, flares and stuff, but they were up underneath. It took a while, but we could feel them. But finally, I just kept trying, and all of a sudden, I had the bag of the stuff in my hand.
I remember I had the flare, and I actually lit a flare to get the Coast Guard's attention so they could see where we were at.
And they had these flares, like you twisted them and they would light and trying to wave them. And
I actually burnt the whole front of my life jacket with the flare.
The flare lit, and Todd dropped it on the raft. So my first reaction was just I threw it,
Some of them I remember going off underneath the water, and like the whole area would light up, and you're like, my gosh, he's got to be able to see that.
Talking to one of the guys, he said they'd probably seen us 25 or 30 times throughout the night.
The wind would gust and spin the helicopter around, and no GPS or anything back then. He goes, there's no point of reference. I had to pretty much start all over. I knew you were there somewhere, just couldn't find you.
But by the time the light would hit us, and then the waves would push us and they would lose us again. But once the sun just started making it light enough, they could see us good and stay with us, and then they were able to pick us all up.
Yeah, just about everybody up except for me. I was the last one, I think, to go.
He was in shock. We didn't know it at the time. We thought he'd lost his mind. Like he was just totally crazy. He had glazed look in his eyes, just crazy.
And when they got me up, I kind of went to shock and wouldn't let go of the basket.
He was just like looking around and just looked at one of the Coast Guard guys and just popped him right in the face, like knocked the guy over.
And they tried to pry my hands off, and I cold cocked one of the guys, and I think he fell out the other side of the copter.
We had to hold him down. We're like, oh my God, he's like, attacking these people. He was just crazy. And I remember, we're young. We didn't know what was going on. We thought he was gone.
Yeah, well, when I got out of the hospital, I went and visited. Yeah, I'd seen him. He was good for it. He told me it was just part of his job.
Then when we landed, they took us all by ambulance to a nearby hospital, and then from there, some of us were released that we didn't need any medical care. The doctor of the emergency room actually put us up in his house.
Whatever's yours, they gave us clothes, food, you name it, and
fed us, and you didn't really want anything. Your tongue was all swollen from salt water, and you really didn't want to eat anything. But they could not have been nicer to us. The owner came down in a private plane the next day and met with us, and the next day he flew us back to Detroit.
if I could still, if that boat never sank, I'd be on, hopefully the captain on it.
Yeah. It was some good memories. New York, City Island, Washington D.C. It was all good memories.
But I really did enjoy the trip. It was really a trip of a lifetime for me. And
it was heady stuff for a young kid.